The distress signal came from deep space. But when the humans arrived to help, there was no one left to save. The ship Aurora cut through the darkness of space, its sleek silver hull gliding toward the distant planet of Ephraim 9. The distress call had been faint, barely more than a whisper in the void. But the message was clear: emergency. Send help. Captain Reed leaned forward in his chair, staring at the readings on the main console. His sharp blue eyes reflected the cold glow of the data scrolling across the screen. This place was supposed to be thriving, he murmured. Where is everybody? Ephraim 9 was an experimental colony, a joint effort between humans and alien allies. Scientists, engineers, and diplomats had lived here, working to build a future where species coexisted. But as Aurora descended through the planet's darkened atmosphere, there was no sign of life. The colony below stretched across the land in perfect stillness. Towers of metal and glass stood untouched. The landing platforms were empty. The main street, where traders and settlers once walked, was a ghost town. Reed turned to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Harris, a no-nonsense soldier with a scar running down his cheek. Any sign of movement? Harris checked his readings. He frowned. None. No heat signatures. No comm signals. It's like they just disappeared. The eerie silence sent a chill through the crew. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Let's check it out, Reed ordered. The empty colony. Their boots echoed against metal walkways as they stepped into the settlement. The air smelled stale. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Tables in the food hall were still set with plates. A kettle sat on a stove, long cooled. A child's toy rested in the dust, as if it had been dropped mid-play. And yet, no bodies. No blood. No signs of a struggle. This doesn't make sense, whispered Dr. Vega, the team's scientist. She picked up a data pad from a desk. The last entry was 3 days ago. A man named Dr. Kane had written. Something is watching us. We hear it at night. It learns. It knows us. We should never have answered the signal. A cold shiver ran down Reed's spine. They didn't send a distress call. Harris turned. What? Reed's voice was tight. They sent a warning. The first sign of horror. The sound of static crackled in their earpieces. The colony's main security system had one last recorded message. The voice was frantic, distorted by interference. A woman's voice. Do not, I repeat, do not, let them know you're human. A long pause. Then, a whisper. They're still here. The transmission cut out. Dr. Vega gasped. Harris raised his rifle, scanning the shadows. Reed's heartbeat thundered in his chest. For the first time since landing, they felt eyes on them. Then, without warning, the doors slammed shut behind them. A whisper echoed in the empty halls. Too late, they know. The metal doors slammed shut, the echo ricocheting down the cold, lifeless corridors. The crew spun around, weapons raised, but there was nothing there. No footsteps. No movement. Just silence. Captain Reed's pulse hammered in his ears. He took a slow, steady breath and tapped his communicator. Aurora, do you copy? Static. He tried again. Aurora, respond. Still nothing. Dr. Vega clutched her datapad, her hands shaking. The colony's power grid is still active. The doors shouldn't have closed on their own. Harris cursed under his breath. It's like something doesn't want us to leave. The crew shared uneasy glances. Something was here. Something unseen. Something that knew them. And it wasn't human. The search for clues. Reed gestured down the corridor. We find the control center. If the colony's security system is still intact, we'll get answers. They moved swiftly, their boots echoing in the dead city. Every room they passed was the same, untouched but abandoned. A meal half-eaten on a table. A jacket draped over a chair. A data terminal left running, its cursor blinking on an unfinished message. They're inside the walls. But they don't need walls. They're inside us. Vega swallowed hard. This isn't a normal evacuation. Reed didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. They reached the security control center, a small room filled with monitors. Harris powered them up, and grainy surveillance footage flickered to life. The screen showed the colony from 3 nights ago. The settlers were moving about as usual. A man stood at a food stall, chatting with a woman. A child played with a ball. Everything seemed normal. Then, the screen flickered. When the footage resumed, the people were gone. The child's ball rolled across the empty street. No bodies. No signs of struggle. Just, gone. Vega covered her mouth with her hand. Where did they go? No one had an answer. The first mistake. Harris checked another terminal. Logs show that the colony never sent a distress call. The signal we picked up, it wasn't from them. Reed's jaw tightened. Then who the hell did we just walk into? Before anyone could respond, Lieutenant Harris stiffened. He was standing near the door, eyes locked on something on the floor. A strange black residue smeared across the metal, like ink. It pulsed. A slow, rhythmic movement, almost like breathing. Vega whispered, "Is that organic?" Harris knelt down, reaching toward it. "Don't touch it." Reed barked. Too late. The moment Harris's gloved fingers brushed the substance, his entire body went rigid. His breathing hitched. His pupils dilated. And then, his mouth opened in silent terror. Vega rushed forward. "Harris? Can you hear me?" Harris's body convulsed. His hands clawed at his helmet as if trying to tear it off. Then, suddenly, he collapsed. Reed grabbed his shoulders. "Harris. Talk to me." Harris's eyes snapped open. But when he spoke, it wasn't his voice. "They see you now." Reed's breath turned to ice. Harris blinked, and for a moment, his reflection did not match his movements. Something is watching. The static in their earpieces surged. And then, a voice. A whisper. Too late, they know. The lights flickered. A chill swept through the air, deep and unnatural. The black residue spread across the walls. And then, from somewhere deep inside the colony, a door creaked open. Something stepped through. The lights flickered, casting jagged shadows along the walls. The whispering static in their earpieces rose to a deafening hum. And then, a door creaked open somewhere deep within the colony. Something stepped through. Reed's breath hitched. He couldn't see it, not yet. But he felt it. A presence pressing against his mind, like unseen fingers reaching into his thoughts. Dr. Vega clutched Harris's arm. "Captain, something's wrong with him." Harris stood still, his pupils blown wide, staring at something only he could see. His lips moved silently, forming words, but no sound came out. Then, in a voice that wasn't his own, he whispered. "You are not alone." The unseen horror. A sound filled the air, not quite footsteps, not quite breathing. Something shifted in the darkness. Reed's grip on his weapon tightened. Back to the ship. Now. Vega grabbed Harris and pulled him toward the exit. The black residue pulsed along the walls, spreading like veins, creeping toward them. They sprinted down the hall, but the doors were already closing. Reed lunged forward, slamming his shoulder into the door. Too slow. The metal sealed shut with a hiss. They were trapped. Harris shuddered violently. His fingers twitched, his skin paling. And then, he spoke. No. Not him. Something inside him. It knows you. It sees you. It remembers. Then he screamed. The sound was inhuman, like multiple voices trapped inside a single throat. Vega stumbled back in terror. Reed grabbed Harris's shoulders, shaking him. Fight it, Harris. Stay with us. But Harris's eyes, they weren't his eyes anymore. They were black. The truth revealed. Vega's voice trembled. Captain, what if this isn't just a parasite? Reed's pulse hammered. What do you mean? She turned the data pad toward him. The old logs, the settlers' last words, they had called it something. It learns. It mimics. It takes what makes us, us. And then we are gone. Reed's stomach dropped. It doesn't just kill. His voice was barely a whisper. It replaces. The black substance slithered closer, moving with purpose. Not random. Sentient. Harris's breathing turned ragged, his muscles convulsing. He turned his gaze to Reed. And then, in a voice that sounded like Harris, but wasn't, he asked. Why do you resist? Reed lifted his gun, heart pounding. Harris, if you're in there, you need to fight this. A slow, horrible smile spread across Harris's face. I do not need to fight. I am already here. Vega screamed. Harris lunged. Reed barely had time to react, he fired. The shot ripped through Harris's chest, but there was no blood. No wound. Harris did not fall. Instead, his body shuddered, ripples spreading through his form. The edges of his face blurred, warping and shifting like liquid. He took a step forward, and his voice was no longer just his. You cannot stop us. You are already part of us. The whispering voices filled the room. Vega grabbed Reed's arm, terror in her eyes. It's in him. It's becoming him. Reed stared into the dark, hollow eyes of his second-in-command. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly helpless. The thing that had once been Harris staggered toward them, its movements unnaturally jerky, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. The black residue continued to pulse across his skin, shifting beneath his uniform. Every inch of him felt wrong, too much, and yet not enough. Reed gripped his weapon tighter, stepping in front of Vega as though to protect her, though he knew it wouldn't matter. They couldn't outrun whatever this was. What is it? Vega whispered, her voice hoarse with fear. She couldn't take her eyes off Harris, whose once vivacious face was now replaced by something empty. It's not human. Reed's voice was barely a breath. Whatever it is, it's using him. Mimicking him. But it's hunting us. The truth we cannot accept. They backed up slowly, trying to keep their distance from the thing that had taken Harris. Reed's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. They'd been expecting a hostile alien species, a predator. What they hadn't accounted for was something that could steal their very selves, their memories, their identity. Vega's voice cracked. Do you think it's trying to take over the colony? Reed glanced down at Harris, or whatever it was now, and then back to Vega. I don't think it just wants to take over. I think it wants to become us. His words hung in the air, a chilling reality settling over them. This thing, this parasite, didn't just want to kill. It wanted to replace. We need to find a way to block it out. Block out the memories, Reed said, but his voice was unsure. How could they even begin to erase what made them human? Who were they, without their memories? Without their past? The first choice. The colony's systems flickered to life again, and they heard a faint, distorted voice over the comms. Warning. Warning. Your identities are compromised. Do not resist. There is no escaping us. Vega closed her eyes, her breath shaky. It's not just Harris. It's inside all of us now. It knows our fears. It knows what we care about. Reed turned sharply, facing the crew. Listen up. We can't let this thing have us. We need to shut down its access to our minds. But Vega shook her head. We can't just shut down our memories, Captain. We'd lose everything. Reed's eyes darkened. Maybe we have to. He paused, realizing the magnitude of what he was suggesting. To erase their humanity, to disconnect from everything that made them who they were. Could they really do it? Could they live without the memories of who they were? It's us or them, Reed said, his voice quiet but firm. If we don't act, there won't be anything left of us. We won't even remember our own names. The sacrifice. Vega stared at him, silent for a long moment. We can't just erase everything, Captain. We're already losing Harris. Don't make us lose each other too. But it was too late. The creature, Harris, took another step toward them, and the black residue began to creep toward them. It wasn't just in his body anymore, it was infecting the room, crawling toward them, slowly and relentlessly. They had no choice. They had to sever the connection between the thing inside them and their very selves. Vega finally spoke, her voice raw. You're right. We have no choice. Reed activated the emergency memory block protocol on the ship. His heart raced as the procedure began. The lights flickered. A soft hum filled the air as the system tried to erase the memories they held dear. The memories that made them human. But as the process began, Harris, or whatever it was, let out a horrible, piercing scream. The sound was layered, like 1,000 voices crying out in pain and fury. No, Vega whispered. It's fighting us. The black residue began to twist and churn around Harris's body. His form contorted, as if the creature inside him was desperately trying to hold on to his identity. The pain was palpable, even in the air. The memories, the emotions, were the last thing that made them human. If they lost them. Harris's voice boomed. You cannot escape what you are. The ship's AI clicked in. Memory reset 10% complete. They had minutes before the process would be irreversible. The desperate final stand. Reed could see the desperation in Vega's eyes. She was fighting it, the same as him. The creature in Harris was still screaming, thrashing against the protocol. The crew was trying to block out the past, but it wasn't just their memories that were being wiped. They were losing themselves. In a final, desperate act, Reed hit the emergency release. The lights flickered out. And for a moment, everything went dark. The darkness felt suffocating. For a brief moment, there was nothing but the sound of their ragged breathing, the faint buzz of the ship's systems, and the oppressive silence of the abandoned colony. It was as though the entire world had paused, holding its breath. Reed's mind was a blur. Memories, his memories, were slipping away. His connection to who he was, to everything that had made him human, was fading with every passing second. It felt like his very soul was being pulled from him, slowly, deliberately. He struggled against the sensation, trying to hold on to the man he once was. To the captain, the leader who had fought for his crew, who had kept them together through countless missions. But in this cold blackness, none of it seemed to matter anymore. Vega's voice broke through the darkness. Captain, we need to do this. It's the only way. Her words cut through his panic, but they were so cold. They were so final. Reed's fingers trembled as he reached for the control panel again. The memory reset procedure was almost complete. But Harris, or what remained of him, was still there. Still fighting them. And the entity inside Harris wasn't the only thing left. It was everywhere, seeping into the walls, into their minds, into the very air they breathed. The entity's hold. As the final moments of the memory wipe began, Reed could feel it. The thing inside Harris, inside them all, was beginning to take root. The black residue had spread into the walls, the floors, the air. It was as if the colony itself had become one with the entity, a massive organism consuming everything in its path. Harris's body began to twitch and jerk, as though it were being reassembled, like a puppet with strings pulled by a force much more ancient than them. No. No, no. Vega cried, her voice shaking with panic. She staggered backward, trying to distance herself from the horror unfolding in front of her. She grasped Reed's arm. We have to get out of here. We can't keep fighting this thing. It's taking over. But Reed's eyes were locked on Harris. The creature inside Harris was morphing, growing stronger, more solid by the second. The black residue shifted as though it were alive, with an intelligence all its own. It was no longer just a parasite. It was becoming them. A desperate bargain. Reed's mind raced. The creature could take over their minds, but it couldn't erase them entirely. There had to be a way to fight it back. There had to be a way to stop it. Without a word, Reed reached toward his sidearm. His hand hovered over the cold metal for a moment, unsure. Vega grabbed his wrist. Don't do it. If you do this, you'll lose everything. You'll lose us. Reed stared at her, his face grim. The truth was in his eyes. The crew was being consumed by this thing, piece by piece. They couldn't run anymore. We have no choice, he said quietly. His fingers wrapped around the weapon. I'll sacrifice myself. I'll stop it before it takes all of us. Vega's face went pale. Captain. But before she could say anything else, the walls trembled. A loud crack echoed through the ship. The entire colony seemed to shake under the weight of the entity's presence. You cannot escape what you are. It was Harris, or what had been Harris, his voice distorted, overlapping with thousands of others. The creature was closer than ever. The walls began to cave in. The colony's internal systems were shutting down. In a moment of clarity, Reed made the decision. If I go, you two must run. His voice was firm, his jaw set. I'll hold it back. The final stand. Reed activated the self-destruct on the colony's core. The countdown began, but the creature was aware of it. The walls around them shuddered violently, and the black residue began to seep into every corner of the control room. The entity, as if sensing its impending end, let out a guttural roar. It was here. It was inside them. It had already started to take them. I'll give you a head start, Reed said to Vega. Get to the ship. Go. She hesitated, her face twisted with fear and sorrow. But I can't leave you. You have to. He shouted. Go. Vega ran. As she disappeared into the shadows, Reed fired his weapon, unleashing a torrent of energy into the walls around him. The black residue shrieked, recoiling as it was burned by the blasts. Harris, no, the thing that had once been Harris, lunged at him. Reed stood tall, not moving, his hand on the detonator. He knew this was it. He had given everything for them. For his crew. For humanity. He stared at the darkness and spoke one final word. Survive. The countdown echoed through the empty halls of Ephraim, 9, a haunting reminder that their time was running out. Reed's weapon discharged again, a flash of energy lighting up the room. The black residue recoiled from the force, but it wasn't enough. Harris, or whatever remained of him, charged, the disembodied whispers of thousands of voices filling the air. It was no longer a man, it was something else, something that had absorbed not just Harris's body but his soul, his very identity. But Reed didn't flinch. He couldn't. This was the moment. The moment to save them all. To make the ultimate sacrifice. Harris lunged, its hands reaching out to consume Reed. But as it did, the last flickers of humanity in Reed's eyes held steady. He pressed the activation button with one final, forceful movement. Self-destruct sequence initiated. The room trembled. The walls groaned under the weight of the entity pressing in, as if the colony itself were trying to escape the parasite that had taken root. But it was too late. Reed glanced one last time at Harris's contorted form. For a moment, he saw a flicker, just a brief flash of recognition in the creature's eyes. Something that wasn't quite gone yet. "I'm sorry, old friend," Reed whispered. Then, everything turned to white-hot brilliance. The explosion rocked the colony, sending a shock wave through space, causing the black residue to disintegrate, scattering like dust in the wind. Harris's twisted form, the dark creature, was consumed in the explosion, vanishing into nothingness. The colony, the entity, everything that had been infected by its malevolent presence, was gone. A world left behind. When the dust settled, Vega stood on the bridge of the Aurora, her hands shaking as she gripped the controls. She'd done it. She'd escaped. But the price had been high. They had lost everything, their crew, their captain, their very memories. She could still hear Reed's voice echoing in her mind. The command to run. To survive. But was survival enough? What was left of humanity after everything they had endured? The screens around her flickered to life as the ship left the planet behind. It was eerily quiet. Too quiet. The weight of their loss pressed down on her chest. Harris, once a comrade. Reed, the captain she had trusted with her life. All of them, gone. But something inside her still burned bright. A small spark of humanity that hadn't been erased by the entity. The real enemy. As the Aurora drifted away from Ephraim 9, Vega stared out into the stars. The mission was over, but something still gnawed at her. She had seen what the creature could do, how it could strip away everything that made them who they were. It could consume them, take their memories, their emotions, their very selves. But it could never take away the spark that kept them fighting. The human spirit that refused to be erased. The entity had been defeated, but Vega knew that this was only the beginning. There were more like it out there, more forces that would try to strip humanity of its essence. And though the cost had been steep, they had learned something vital: humanity, for all its flaws, would never be broken. A sound broke her from her thoughts, an alert from the ship's communication system. A message had come through, faint but unmistakable. Distress signal received. Vega froze. She knew what that meant. The entity was gone, but its legacy had already begun to spread. And she couldn't let it win. She turned toward the console, determination hardening her features. They would continue the fight. They would protect humanity, no matter the cost. Because that was what it meant to be human. A new mission. Vega pressed a button on the console, sending a response to the distress call. Her voice was steady, despite the weight on her heart. "This is the Aurora. We're coming. Prepare for rescue." She knew the road ahead would be difficult. The shadows of what they had faced on Ephraim 9 would always linger. But there was something else that was growing inside her. Hope. Hope that humanity, her humanity, was something worth fighting for. And that no matter what came next, she would never stop fighting for it. The stars outside the Aurora glimmered like a field of diamonds, silent witnesses to the vastness of space. But for Vega, they were reminders of something far more intimate, of everything they had lost, and everything they still had to fight for. Her fingers rested lightly on the controls, the ship's hum steady beneath her, as if it, too, understood the burden she carried. The mission had changed. There was no longer any illusion of safety. The entity was gone, but its essence, its fearsome legacy, still lingered like a shadow stretching across the galaxy. As the Aurora approached the source of the distress signal, Vega felt a weight pressing down on her chest. The last few days had shattered everything she had believed. She had watched a fellow officer, a friend, become something else, something unrecognizable, until the explosion had finally torn it all away. She had seen Captain Reed give everything, sacrificing his very self to stop the invasion, leaving her to carry on alone. But one thing remained: humanity's indomitable spirit. The same spirit that had endured, even in the face of unimaginable horror. A new challenge. The distress signal had been coming from a small, isolated research station, far from any major settlements. As the Aurora drifted into the station's orbit, Vega activated the ship's long-range scanners. The station was dark, all systems seemed to be offline. "I don't like this," Vega muttered under her breath. No answer. No signs of life. Just silence. She knew this was dangerous. The enemy they had faced on Ephraim 9 had been insidious. It didn't just destroy, it replaced. It had used fear and confusion to divide them, to make them doubt each other. What if the same thing was happening here? What if this station had fallen prey to the same horrors? But Vega couldn't stop. She wouldn't. They had come this far, and she knew that there were others out there like her, others who would never succumb to the darkness. "The door we cannot close." The airlock hissed as the hatch opened, and Vega stepped onto the research station's metal floors. She could smell the stale air inside, as if the station had been abandoned for far longer than a few days. The lights were dim, barely enough to illuminate the corridors. She pulled her weapon from her side, the cold steel comforting against her palm, and began to walk down the long hall. Every step echoed. Every shadow seemed to move, almost alive. And then, a voice crackled over her communicator. "Vega." Her breath caught. It was a familiar voice, Reed's voice. But it wasn't possible. He had sacrificed himself. She had heard him say goodbye, had felt the last of his humanity slip away. This couldn't be him. "Vega, can you hear me?" It was distorted, twisted. Not entirely human. Vega paused in her tracks. What was this? Was it a message from the past? Some glitch in the station's systems? Or had the creature somehow survived, mimicking Reed? Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly brought her weapon up. But then, another thought hit her: if this was Reed, if it was really him, could she leave him? Could she just walk away? The heart of the matter. She moved cautiously through the station, each step more deliberate than the last. As she approached the central hub, she could see something flickering through the thin walls of the observation windows. Shapes. Human figures. Her pulse quickened. She had to know. She had to understand. When she reached the door to the main control room, the panel was locked, but it didn't take long for her to hack into the system. The door slid open with a soft hiss. What she saw inside froze her blood. There were humans inside, but not the way she had expected. They were standing motionless, their eyes glassy and distant, as though they were waiting. And at the center of the room, surrounded by the people, was a figure, a silhouette she knew all too well. Captain Reed. Or what was left of him. He was standing perfectly still, his body slightly altered, like he had been reconstructed. His skin had darkened, his eyes were vacant, and his mouth barely moved. But his voice was unmistakable. "Vega. Why did you leave me?" The test of humanity. Her heart clenched. This wasn't Reed. It couldn't be. It was the entity. It was using him again, pulling from her memories of him, twisting her grief and her guilt, turning it into a weapon. The creature was trying to make her doubt herself, trying to pull her in. "No," she said firmly, her voice trembling but resolute. "I will not give in to you. I know what you are." Reed, or the thing that looked like him, laughed, a sound that echoed in the room like 1,000 voices overlapping. "You are just like us. You can't escape it. You're already part of us. You always have been." Vega raised her weapon. "I won't be you." She fired. The blast hit the figure at the center of the room, and it staggered backward, its form distorting. It screamed in fury, but Vega didn't hesitate. She fired again, and again, until the creature crumbled into the air, disintegrating before her eyes. And with that, the last of the darkness was wiped away. A lesson in humanity. As the station's lights flickered back to life, Vega took a deep breath. The room was empty. The horrors were gone. The last remnants of the entity had vanished. But there was something else that remained, the sense of purpose she had carried from Ephraim 9. The distress signal had been real, but it hadn't come from a place of need, it had been a call to arms. Humanity had faced its darkest hour, but it had endured. And through it all, Vega had remained human. She had never given in to the shadows. She had never allowed herself to become what the creature had wanted. And now, as she stood in the silent station, she realized something profound. It's not what happens to us that defines us. It's how we choose to respond.